Welcome to this journey into the forgotten shadows of American history, where I invite you to step back in time with me, to an era when gaslight flickered in grand Victorian parlors and secrets festered behind closed doors in ways that still defy comprehension. Before we begin, I'd like to know, where are you watching this from, and what time is it there? Are you alone in the dark? Perhaps late at night, or watching during a quiet afternoon? Tell me in the comments below. There's something about sharing these stories together across time and distance that makes them feel even more real, more immediate. We're building a community here, a gathering of those who dare to look into the abyss of human nature, and I want to know you're there with me. Now let me take you to Maine. The year is 1901. The 20th century has just begun, bringing with it promises of progress, electric lights, and modern conveniences. But in the dense forests of Penobscot County, just outside the lumber town of Bangor, an old darkness still thrived, hidden behind the respectable facade of wealth and Victorian propriety. The Callahan mansion stood 3 miles from town, accessible only by a winding dirt road that became nearly impassable during the brutal Maine winters. It was a Gothic revival structure, all pointed arches and dark timber, built in 1873 by industrialist Macabre Callahan, who had made his fortune in the lumber trade. The house had 12 rooms, a wine cellar, and what local workers whispered about, a secondary basement that Marcus had insisted on adding during construction, accessible only through a concealed door in the main cellar. The workers who built it signed confidentiality agreements, unusual for the time. Marcus Callahan died in the winter of 1897, officially from pneumonia, though the attending physician noted in his private records that wouldn't surface until decades later, that he'd never seen a case of pneumonia that left a man so emaciated as if he'd been starved, despite the household's obvious wealth. His widow, Eleanor Callahan, was 43 at the time of his death. Born Eleanor Fitzgerald in County Cork, Ireland, she had immigrated to America in 1852 as a child of 7 during the final years of the Great Famine. What happened to her family during those years of starvation remained a mystery she never discussed, even with her husband. She arrived in Boston alone, was raised in a Catholic orphanage, and through extraordinary determination and her striking beauty, managed to marry into wealth by age 23. By 1901, Eleanor was 47 years old, yet townspeople remarked on her unusually youthful appearance. She had pale skin, dark hair that showed no gray, and eyes that one visiting minister described in his diary as disturbingly vital, as though she possessed some secret knowledge of vitality itself. She rarely came to town, but when she did for charity events or church socials, she drew attention. She was elegant, refined, spoke with a cultured accent that had lost most of its Irish lilt, and dressed in the finest fashions from Boston and New York. She was also, as the town would discover, a hunter. Between March and September of 1901, 3 men vanished from the Bangor area. Each disappearance seemed unconnected at first. These were transient times. Men came and went, following lumber work, railroad construction, mill jobs. But these 3 had something in common. Each had been seen at social events with Eleanor Callahan in the weeks before they vanished. Each had told someone, a boarding house owner, a fellow worker, a bartender, that they'd been invited to dine at the Callahan mansion. None of them were ever seen alive again. What Sheriff Thomas Whitmore discovered in November of that year, when he finally obtained a warrant to search the Callahan estate, would become one of the most disturbing cases in Maine's criminal history. The official reports were sealed for 50 years. When they were finally opened in 1951, 3 historians who reviewed them independently contacted the authorities, believing the documents must be elaborate hoaxes. They were not hoaxes. But what exactly happened in that mansion? How did a respected widow become something far darker? And perhaps most disturbing, what happened to Eleanor Callahan herself, who vanished without a trace the night before the sheriff arrived? The answers, as we'll discover, are far more complex and horrifying than anyone in 1901 could have imagined. To understand the horror of Eleanor Callahan, we must first understand the world that created her. The year 1901 marked a turning point in American history. Queen Victoria had just died, ending an era. President McKinley would be assassinated in September. The United States was emerging as an industrial power, but much of rural America still lived in isolation, particularly in places like northern Maine. Bangor, Maine, in 1901, was a lumber town past its prime. Once called the lumber capital of the world in the 1850s, it had seen its industry decline as forests were depleted. The population hovered around 20,000, a mix of old Yankee families, Irish immigrants, and French Canadians who'd come south for work. The town had electric lights downtown, a telephone exchange, and 3 newspapers, but venture a few miles out, and you entered wilderness. Dense pine forests, frozen streams, and scattered farms connected by rough roads that became impassable in winter. This isolation was crucial. The Callahan mansion sat in a pocket of this wilderness, hidden from casual observation. The nearest neighbor was nearly 2 miles away, the Hutchins farm, where Samuel and Martha Hutchins, both in their 60s, kept mostly to themselves. When later questioned, Samuel would say they'd seen lights in the Callahan mansion at odd hours, heard sounds they couldn't quite identify, but minded their own business. Wasn't our place to question what a wealthy widow did in her own home, he told investigators. Social stratification was rigid. Eleanor Callahan, as the widow of an industrialist, occupied the upper tier of local society. She was a benefactor of St. Joseph's Catholic Church, donated to the Bangor Public Library, and hosted occasional charity teas. This social position provided protection. When men disappeared, no one immediately suspected the refined widow who spoke French, played piano, and wore imported silks. The men who vanished were from the vulnerable margins of society. The first was David Murphy, 32, an Irish immigrant who worked at the Penobscot Chemical Fiber Company. He'd been in America for 3 years, sent money home to Kerry, and was known as reliable and hard-working. In March 1901, he met Eleanor at a St. Patrick's Day celebration at the church. She was charming, asked about Ireland, spoke of her own childhood there. 2 weeks later, he told his boarding house landlady, Mrs. Agnes Porter, that he'd been invited to dinner at the Callahan mansion. "She's a fine lady," he said, "and lonely, I think. Nothing improper, just dinner and conversation." He left on March 28th, wearing his best suit, carrying a bottle of wine he'd purchased as a gift. Mrs. Porter never saw him again. When she inquired at the mansion a week later, the housekeeper, a stern woman named Martha Grayson, said Mr. Murphy had dined with Mrs. Callahan and left around 10 o'clock. Perhaps he'd moved on to another town, for work, as men often did. The second disappearance came in June. Thomas Brennan, 29, a railway surveyor from Massachusetts, was in Bangor mapping potential extensions to the Bangor and Aroostook Railroad. He met Eleanor at a town social event, was reportedly fascinated by her sophistication. He wrote to his sister in Worcester, "I've met the most intriguing woman, a widow of substantial means and considerable culture. She's invited me to her estate to discuss the railway's impact on local property values. I sense an opportunity for advancement." He went to the Callahan mansion on June 15th. His equipment and belongings remained at his hotel. His employer reported him missing on June 25th. The local marshal made inquiries. Again, Martha Grayson stated he'd visited, dined, and departed late in the evening. No further investigation was pursued. The third disappearance triggered everything that followed. Jonathan Pierce, 34, was different from the others. He came from a prominent Boston family, was educated at Harvard, and was in Bangor, assessing lumber investments for his family's firm. He met Eleanor at a concert of chamber music at the Bangor Opera House in August. His younger brother, William Pierce, a lawyer, had accompanied him to Maine. Jonathan went to the Callahan mansion on September 3rd. When he didn't return to their hotel that night, William immediately became concerned. Unlike the others, Jonathan had family with resources and connections. William Pierce went to the mansion the next morning and was told by Martha Grayson that Jonathan had never arrived for dinner. This directly contradicted what Jonathan had told his brother. William Pierce went to Sheriff Thomas Whitmore, a methodical investigator who'd served in the Spanish-American War and had a reputation for thoroughness. William's insistence, backed by his family's influence, forced action. Whitmore began asking questions and patterns emerged. 3 men, all roughly the same age range, all unmarried, all having been seen with Eleanor Callahan, all vanished after visiting her estate. But getting a warrant to search the home of a wealthy widow required substantial evidence. Eleanor had social protection. The county prosecutor was reluctant. Weeks passed as Whitmore gathered statements, checked records, built his case. Meanwhile, Eleanor continued her routine, attending church, making charitable donations, appearing at social functions, always elegant, always composed. In his personal journal, Sheriff Whitmore wrote, "There is something in her eyes that unsettles me. She looks at people the way a scientist might examine specimens under glass. When I questioned her about Mr. Pierce, she showed perfect composure. No nervousness, no indignation at being questioned. Just a calm, almost amused cooperation. I've interrogated many criminals in my career. She's different. There's an intelligence there and something else. An emptiness, perhaps, or a hunger." The Victorian era, for all its talk of progress and civilization, was also a time of dark undercurrents. Spiritualism was popular. People held seances in parlors. Pseudo-scientific theories about vitality, life force, and rejuvenation circulated in respected circles. Some doctors prescribed bizarre treatments, animal extracts, electrical stimulation, even consuming raw organic materials for health. The line between medicine and mysticism was blurrier than we might imagine. Eleanor Callahan, as investigators would discover, had an extensive library. Medical texts, yes, but also grimoires, occult treatises, books on ancient religious practices. A particular volume, imported from Paris, discussed the beliefs of various cultures regarding the consumption of human flesh as a means of absorbing the vitality of the consumed. The book was heavily annotated in Eleanor's elegant handwriting. By late October, Whitmore had enough for a warrant, but he made a critical mistake. He sent a deputy to serve notice that he'd be searching the property on November 4th. He believed this was proper legal procedure. What he didn't anticipate was giving Eleanor time to disappear. The warrant was served on October 30th, 1901. Deputy Marshal Henry Clay rode out to the Callahan mansion in the afternoon, under grey skies threatening snow. He found Martha Grayson, the housekeeper, answering the door. Eleanor Callahan was not at home, Grayson said. She'd gone to Portland on business and wouldn't return. Until the following week, Clay left the warrant notice and returned to town. This would later be identified as Sheriff Whitmore's first crucial error. The second was waiting until November 4th to conduct the search, giving Eleanor 5 full days of warning. But perhaps it wouldn't have mattered. As we'll see, Eleanor Callahan was always several steps ahead. On the morning of November 4th, Sheriff Whitmore arrived at the Callahan mansion with 4 deputies, the county medical examiner, Dr. Harold, Finch, and William Pierce, who'd insisted on being present. It was a cold morning, temperature barely above freezing, with frost covering the grounds. The mansion looked abandoned. No smoke from the chimneys, no lights in the windows despite the grey dawn. Martha Grayson answered their knocking after several minutes. She appeared disheveled, unusual for a woman known for her stern propriety. Her eyes were red, as if she'd been crying. "Mrs. Callahan is not here," she said simply. When pressed for details, she claimed Eleanor had left 3 days prior, said she was going to Boston, didn't say when she'd return. No, she didn't take much luggage. No, there was no forwarding address. Yes, they could search the house. She had nothing to hide. The search began in the main floors. The mansion was elegantly furnished, but strangely impersonal, like a museum rather than a home. The parlor contained expensive furniture arranged with precision, not comfort. The dining room table could seat 12, though dust suggested it hadn't been used recently. The library held hundreds of books, organized by subject. Dr. Finch noted the unusual medical texts, the occult volumes. One book lay open on the desk, a French text on preservation techniques used by ancient cultures. Eleanor's bedroom was on the second floor. Here, finally, signs of personality emerged. Expensive dresses in the wardrobe, all in dark colors, black, deep purple, burgundy. A vanity with French perfumes, jewelry that suggested wealth but not ostentation, a journal on the nightstand. Sheriff Whitmore opened the journal carefully. The first entry was dated January 1st, 1898, just months after Marcus Callahan's death. The handwriting was elegant, controlled, but the content was disturbing. The first entry read, "Marcus is gone. The house is finally mine. The hunger remains. It has been with me since childhood, since those dark months in Cork when Mother made us promise never to speak of what we did to survive. But I was 7. I remember, and I remember how it felt. Not just the satisfaction of ending hunger, but something else, a vitality, a strength that came after. The priests would call it evil. The doctors would call it madness. But what if it's neither? What if it's simply nature read in tooth and claw, as Mr. Darwin wrote? Whitmore read several more entries aloud, his voice becoming progressively quieter. The journal documented Eleanor's philosophy, her justifications, her plans. She wrote of identifying suitable subjects, always men, always alone, always transient. She wrote of studying anatomy texts, of experimenting with preservation methods, of her belief that consuming certain organs would restore youth and vitality. It was pseudoscience mixed with occultism, rationalized through the cold logic of a deeply disturbed mind. But the journal stopped in August 1901, after the entry about meeting Jonathan Pierce. The final entry simply read, "They're beginning to notice. I'll need to be more careful." Deputy Clay found the door to the cellar behind the kitchen. Stone steps descended into darkness. The main cellar was typical. Wine racks, preserved foods in jars, coal for heating, storage boxes. But Dr. Finch, examining the walls, noticed irregularities in the stonework on the north wall. He pressed various stones until one shifted slightly. A section of wall, 6 feet tall and 4 feet wide, swung inward on hidden hinges. A draft of cold air emerged, carrying a smell that made several men step back. It wasn't the smell of decay exactly, though that was present. It was something else. Chemicals, preservation agents, and underneath it all, something sweet and rotten. Whitmore lit a lantern and stepped through. The hidden room was approximately 12 feet by 15 feet, with a ceiling 7 feet high. It had been constructed with care, the walls lined with wood, the floor covered in tile that could be easily cleaned. The room contained a heavy wooden table, stained dark, with leather restraints at the corners. Shelves along one wall held jars filled with liquid and objects that Dr. Finch would later identify as human organs, preserved in formaldehyde and alcohol solutions. A large chest against the far wall was locked. Deputy Marshal Clay forced it open. Inside were personal effects: watches, rings, a railway surveyor's compass, a Catholic rosary, items that would later be identified as belonging to the missing men. Also in the chest were 3 leather-bound ledgers. The first ledger was a record. Each page documented a name, a date, physical characteristics, and detailed notes on what Eleanor had done. David Murphy, March 28th, Thomas Brennan, June 15th, Jonathan Pierce, September 3rd. But there were more names, dating back to 1898, 11 men total over 3.5 years. The second ledger was more disturbing. It contained recipes, for lack of a better word, describing preparation methods, cooking temperatures, and Eleanor's observations on the effects. She'd written notes like a scientist documenting experiments. Subject number 4, age 31, excellent physical condition. Liver particularly rich, consumed over 3 days. Noticeable improvement in skin elasticity, reduction in joint pain. The third ledger was a diary of sorts, more personal than the clinical records. Here, Eleanor wrote about her childhood in Ireland, about the Great Famine, about watching her family starve, about the day her mother had whispered to her, and her brother, "God will forgive us. We must survive." She was 7 years old when she first tasted human flesh, butchered from a stranger who died on the road near their cottage. The memory never left her. Neither did the association between consumption and survival, between hunger and power. Dr. Finch, examining the preserved organs, estimated they represented at least 8 different individuals. But where were the bodies, the bones, the rest of the physical evidence? Deputy Carter found the answer. At the back of the hidden room, another door, smaller, led to a tunnel. The tunnel descended gradually, carved through earth and rock, propped with timber supports. It extended nearly 60 feet before opening into a natural cave system. The limestone caves of Maine, formed over millennia, riddled the region. This particular cave was small but large enough. Here they found the remains. Bones, stripped clean, organized by type. Skulls arranged on a natural stone shelf. 11 of them like trophies. Some bones showed saw marks, evidence of dismemberment. Others showed scoring from knives. The cave floor was stained dark. Tell me in the comments what you think is happening so far. Did Eleanor act alone? Was Martha Grayson complicit, or just a terrified employee? And how did Eleanor know to disappear before the search? Was someone warning her? Share your theories below. I'm genuinely curious what you think at this point in our journey. The discovery in the cave made national news. Reporters descended on Bangor from Boston, New York, even Chicago. The New York Times ran a headline, "Cannibal Widow of Maine, Society Lady Accused of Unspeakable Crimes." The Boston Globe printed sketches of the mansion, the hidden room, the cave. The story competed for front-page space with news of President Roosevelt's policies and the Pan-American Exposition. But Eleanor Callahan had vanished. Sheriff Whitmore organized the most extensive manhunt in Maine history. Telegraph. Messages went to every police department in New England. Eleanor's photograph, taken from a church directory, was distributed to railway stations, hotels, ports. William Pierce offered a substantial reward for information leading to her capture. The reward was $5,000, an enormous sum in 1901, but it was as if Eleanor Callahan had dissolved into fog. No confirmed sightings, no railway tickets purchased under her name, no hotel registrations. It was possible, investigators reasoned, that she'd changed her appearance, used a false name, had money hidden away for exactly this contingency. The ledgers suggested a methodical, patient personality, someone capable of planning years in advance. Meanwhile, the investigation into her past revealed disturbing details. Whitmore sent inquiries to Boston, to the Catholic orphanage where Eleanor had been raised. The record showed she'd arrived in 1852, age 7, alone. No family members, No documentation except a note from the ships. Captain stating she'd been found hiding in cargo, nearly dead from starvation. The nuns raised her, noted she was exceptionally intelligent but emotionally distant. She rarely smiled, never formed close friendships, spent most of her time reading. At age 16, she left the orphanage to work as a domestic servant in a wealthy household. Here, the trail became murky. Employment records from the 1860s were spotty. Whitmore traced her through 3 different wealthy families in Boston, each employment lasting approximately 2 years. When he interviewed surviving family members, a pattern emerged. In each case, an elderly male member of the household had died unexpectedly. Natural causes were assumed. The men were old, after all. But one woman, Mrs. Charlotte Winthrop, now in her 70s, remembered Eleanor. She was peculiar, Mrs. Winthrop said. Beautiful, competent, but there was something wrong with her eyes. Empty somehow. My father doted on her before he died. He changed, his will to leave her a small annuity. After the funeral, she simply disappeared. We tried to find her to deliver the money, but she'd vanished. Had Eleanor been killing even then, in her 20s? If so, how many victims preceded the 11 found in Maine? Dr. Finch conducted autopsies on the remains found in the cave. Working with a forensic expert from Harvard Medical School, he attempted to identify the victims and determine causes of death. The bones were clean, making identification difficult, but dental records and bone measurements eventually confirmed the identities of the 3 recent victims, Murphy, Brennan, and Pierce. The other 8 remained unidentified, though their age ranges were estimated between 25 and 40. Cause of death for one victim could be determined, a fractured hyoid bone in the throat, indicating strangulation. Another skull showed evidence of blunt force trauma to the back of the head. The others showed no obvious signs of trauma to the bones themselves, leading Finch to theorize poisoning. Eleanor's library contained texts on toxicology, with passages about various poisons underlined. The community of Bangor reacted with shock, denial, and a disturbing amount of fascination. Some refused to believe it. Eleanor had been a benefactor, a cultured lady. There must be a mistake. Others recalled strange details, how she never seemed to age, how she always wore long sleeves even in summer, how her housekeeper Martha Grayson seemed frightened of her. Martha Grayson became the focus of intense scrutiny. She was arrested as a material witness and subjected to hours of questioning. Her testimony revealed a portrait of life in the Callahan mansion that was somehow more horrifying for its banality. Martha Grayson was 39 years old, originally from Nova Scotia, had worked for the Callahans since 1895. She was a plain woman, unmarried, had few prospects when Eleanor hired her. The pay was generous, the work not, particularly demanding. Marcus Callahan was frequently away on business. Eleanor was a quiet employer, exacting but fair. Everything changed after Marcus died in 1897. According to Martha, Eleanor became different, more focused. She began spending long hours in the library, reading medical texts. She installed the hidden door to the secondary cellar herself, hiring a carpenter from Portland rather than using local labor. She told Martha the space would be for preserving meats and storing wine at specific temperatures. Martha claimed she didn't know about the murders until late 1899, over a year after they'd begun. She'd gone to the cellar to fetch wine and heard sounds from behind the hidden door, which Eleanor had carelessly left slightly ajar. Through the gap, Martha saw Eleanor working at the table, saw what was on the table, saw the jars on the shelves. When questioned why she didn't go to the authorities immediately, Martha broke down. Eleanor, she said, had known she'd seen. Eleanor confronted her that same evening very calmly and explained the situation. Martha could leave, of course, but Eleanor would tell the sheriff that Martha had been her accomplice from the beginning. Who would believe a poor housekeeper over a wealthy widow? Eleanor had already prepared documents forged in Martha's handwriting that would implicate her. But more than threats, Eleanor offered incentive. Martha's wages doubled. Eleanor promised that if Martha remained silent and occasionally helped with small tasks, disposing of clothing, maintaining the hidden room's cleanliness, providing alibis, Martha would be well provided for. When Eleanor eventually moved on, perhaps to Europe, Martha would receive the mansion and a substantial sum. I was frightened, Martha testified, tears streaming down her face. But I was also desperate. I had nothing, no family, no savings, no prospects, and she was so calm about it all, so rational. She said the men she chose were transients, no one would miss them. She was performing a kind of natural selection. She had convinced herself it was justified. And God help me, I wanted to believe her because believing her meant I could stay in that house, safe and fed. Martha's testimony revealed other details. Eleanor didn't act impulsively. She studied potential victims for weeks, sometimes months. She chose carefully, men who were alone, passing through, unlikely to be immediately missed. She was charming when she needed. To be could make men feel special, chosen. The dinner invitations were elaborate seductions, not sexual but intellectual and emotional. She made her victims feel valued, important. They came to the mansion willingly, even eagerly. The method varied, sometimes poison in the wine, something that worked slowly so the victim would become incapacitated during the meal, sometimes a blow to the head when they turned away. She was stronger than she looked, Martha said. Unnaturally strong for a woman, her size. After death, Eleanor worked methodically. The table in the hidden room had drainage channels. She had surgical tools, learned from her medical texts. She was, Martha said with horror, very skilled. She separated usable from unusable, preserved what interested her, prepared the rest for consumption. The bones went to the cave, cleaned and organized, and she ate. Not from desperate hunger, but from belief. She genuinely thought consuming human flesh, particularly certain organs, provided benefits. She kept meticulous records of her consumption and its effects. She believed she was conducting science, however twisted. The prosecutor asked Martha the question everyone wanted answered. Why hadn't Eleanor fled before 1901? Why take the risk? Martha's answer chilled the courtroom. She didn't think she'd ever be caught. She was too careful, too intelligent. She thought herself above suspicion. When Sheriff Whitmore started investigating, she was annoyed more than frightened. She said, "The sheriff was a small-town fool who'd never prove anything. It wasn't until the warrant was served that she realized she'd miscalculated." Martha was tried as an accessory to murder. The prosecution sought the death penalty, but the jury, perhaps swayed by her testimony against Eleanor, convicted her of lesser charges. She was sentenced to 20 years in the Maine state prison. She died there in 1908 of tuberculosis, age 46. But Martha's testimony provided crucial details about Eleanor's final days at the mansion. When the warrant notice was served, Eleanor had not fled in panic. She spent 2 days methodically burning documents, packing specific items, preparing for departure. She told Martha she'd return someday when the furor died down, perhaps under a different name. She had money hidden in various banks under false identities. She had plans, contingencies. On the night of November 2nd, 2 days before the scheduled search, Eleanor left the mansion. She wore traveling clothes, carried a single suitcase, walked down the dark road toward town. Martha never saw her again. As the investigation expanded, Whitmore uncovered something unexpected. Eleanor had not been entirely isolated. She had correspondents, people who shared her beliefs or at least tolerated them. Among her papers, investigators found letters. Most were mundane, correspondence with Boston merchants, charity organizations, her late husband's business associates. But several letters stood out. They were signed with initials only, discussed topics in veiled language that became transparent when read in context with Eleanor's diaries. One letter, dated April 1900, signed VM from New York, discussed the practices of certain ancient societies and the vitality theories proposed by Dr. Hammond, referring to a controversial New York physician who'd proposed bizarre rejuvenation treatments. The letter writer seemed to share Eleanor's interest in life force transference through consumption. Another letter from TB in Philadelphia was more explicit. It discussed successful preparations and disposal methods, clearly referring to murder and cannibalism in coded but unmistakable terms. The writer mentioned the Society of Eternal Vitality, an organization Whitmore had never heard of. Sheriff Whitmore contacted police departments in New York and Philadelphia. The investigation expanded beyond Maine. What they discovered was disturbing. A loose network of perhaps a dozen individuals, mostly wealthy, mostly isolated, who corresponded about their shared obsession with consuming human flesh for rejuvenation. They didn't meet openly or have formal structure, but they exchanged letters, shared theories, provided each other with moral support for their atrocities. Most were never identified or prosecuted. The letters used initials or pseudonyms. The investigation into this network was quietly suppressed by authorities who feared public panic and sensationalism. But fragments of information survived in sealed records. Dr. William Hammond, a real historical figure, had been Surgeon General of the U.S. Army during the Civil War and later became a controversial neurologist in New York. He proposed various unorthodox treatments and wrote about nervous energy and vitality in ways that some disturbed individuals interpreted as justification for extreme practices. There's no evidence Hammond himself advocated cannibalism, but his theories were twisted by others. Eleanor's library contained 2 of his books, heavily annotated. The investigation also uncovered financial irregularities. Eleanor had money in banks under at least 3 different names. She'd been systematically transferring funds for years, creating a network of hidden assets. When authorities tried to trace these accounts, they found most had been emptied in the weeks before her disappearance. She'd planned her escape carefully. One detail particularly troubled Whitmore. Among Eleanor's papers was a map of the United States with several cities marked: Portland, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Chicago, San Francisco. Next to each city were dates spanning 1902 to 1910. Was this a plan for future locations? Was Eleanor intending to continue her crimes across the country, moving from city to city? The search for Eleanor Callahan became one of the first national manhunts in American history, predating the FBI by years. But without modern communication systems, without national police coordination, without photographs distributed widely, the search faltered. Alleged sightings came from across the country. A woman matching her description seen boarding a ship to Europe in Boston, another seen in a New Orleans hotel, yet another in a San Francisco boarding house. None were confirmed. William Pierce, the brother of victim Jonathan Pierce, became obsessed with finding Eleanor. He hired private detectives, offered rewards, pursued every lead personally. His hunt consumed him. His family eventually had him committed to a private sanitarium in 1905, suffering from what doctors called obsessive melancholia. He died in 1909, never having found the woman who killed his brother. The Callahan mansion stood empty for years. Local children said it was haunted, reported seeing lights in the windows at night, hearing sounds from the cellar. Most likely these were imaginations fueled by the terrible stories. But one report from 1907 gave investigators pause. A traveling salesman staying overnight in Bangor reported seeing a woman matching Eleanor's description near the abandoned mansion, just standing on the road, looking at the house. When he approached, she disappeared into the trees. The report was investigated, but nothing was found. In 1912, the mansion burned down. The fire started in the middle of the night, cause undetermined. Some said it was local people, tired of the dark landmark. Others whispered that Eleanor herself had returned to destroy evidence. The fire was so intense that it melted the stone foundations of the cellar. The hidden room, the tunnel to the cave, all of it was sealed under rubble and ash. The land was eventually absorbed by the state forest. Today, if you know where to look, you can still find the stone foundations, overgrown with moss and pine seedlings, slowly being reclaimed by the Maine wilderness. The cave system was sealed by authorities in 1902, but local spelunkers claim to have found the entrance in the 1960s, though they refuse to say exactly where it is. The legal aftermath was complex. Since Eleanor was never captured, she was never tried. She was declared legally dead in 1908, 7 years after her disappearance, a standard legal procedure. But without a body, without confirmation, the declaration felt hollow. Her estate, already depleted by her hidden transfers, was seized by the state and used to compensate the families of identified victims. The Catholic Church, embarrassed by Eleanor's membership and donations, conducted a private investigation. A priest was sent to review baptismal records in County Cork, Ireland, trying to verify Eleanor's origins. He found records of a Fitzgerald family in the parish she'd named, but the family had all died or emigrated during the famine. Whether Eleanor was truly from that family or had assumed a dead girl's identity was never determined. The church quietly removed her name from all records and never spoke publicly about the case. Dr. Finch, the medical examiner, published a paper in a medical journal in 1903 describing the case in clinical terms without naming Eleanor specifically. He theorized about a form of what would later be called psychopathy, combined with delusional beliefs about vitality and rejuvenation. His paper was controversial and largely ignored by the medical establishment, which preferred to dismiss Eleanor as simply insane rather than examine the psychological mechanisms that enabled her crimes. Sheriff Thomas Whitmore continued investigating the case until his retirement in 1915. In his later years, he gave occasional interviews to journalists, always maintaining that Eleanor Callahan was alive somewhere, living under a false identity, possibly still killing. She was too careful, too intelligent, too committed to her delusions to stop, he said in a 1920 interview with the Bangor Daily News. Somewhere, in some city, under some other name, I believe, she's still hunting. And I believe she'll never be caught because she learned from her mistakes in Maine. Whitmore died in 1924, age 75. Among his personal effects, his family found a file on the Callahan case that he'd kept updated until shortly before his death. It contained newspaper clippings about unsolved disappearances of men in various cities, notes about patterns he'd identified, theories he'd developed. His obsession with the case had never truly ended. The story of Eleanor Callahan should have ended in 1901, fading into history as another dark tale from America's past. But the story refused to die. Over the decades, fragments emerged, pieces of evidence that suggested the horror might have continued. In 1957, a journalist named Robert Thorne, writing for a Portland newspaper, became interested in cold cases from the turn of the century. He was researching a book on unsolved Maine mysteries when he came across the Callahan case. Intrigued, he began investigating, reviewing old records, interviewing elderly residents who remembered the scandal. In the Bangor Public Library archives, Thorne found something that previous investigators had missed: a photograph from a 1903 charity event in Portland, taken nearly 2 years after Eleanor's disappearance. The photograph showed a group of wealthy donors at a fundraiser for an orphanage. In the back row, partially obscured by other people, was a woman who bore a striking resemblance to Eleanor Callahan. She was identified in the photo caption as Mrs. Victoria Morrison, recently arrived from Boston. Thorne tracked down information about Victoria Morrison. She'd appeared in Portland society in early 1902, claimed to be a widow from Massachusetts, involved herself in charitable work, particularly with organizations that help transient workers and sailors. She was cultured, well-spoken, and according to those who remembered her, looked younger than her claimed age of 52. Victoria Morrison disappeared from Portland in 1906, leaving debts and angry creditors. But Thorne found something else. Between 1902 and 1906, 7 men in Portland had vanished without explanation. All were transients, sailors, or temporary workers. All had been seen at charity events or social functions. No bodies were ever found. No investigation was launched because, as one police report from the era stated, such men frequently move on without notice. Could Victoria Morrison have been Eleanor Callahan? Thorne thought so. The physical description matched, the pattern of behavior matched, the disappearances matched. But he had no proof, just circumstantial evidence and the haunting similarity in the photograph. Thorne attempted to trace Victoria Morrison beyond Portland. He found fragmentary records suggesting a woman of that name appeared in Baltimore in 1907, disappeared from there in 1910. Another possible sighting in Chicago in 1912. The trail went cold after that, lost in the chaos of world. War I and the great influenza pandemic of 1918. Thorne published his findings in a series of newspaper articles in 1958. The articles generated substantial public interest and some controversy. Descendants of the Portland victims contacted him, grateful that someone finally remembered their lost relatives. But Thorne also received threatening letters, unsigned, warning him to stop investigating. One letter, postmarked from San Francisco, simply said, "Some things should remain buried. For your own sake, let sleeping dogs lie." Thorne was unsettled by the letter, but continued his research. In 1960, he suffered a heart attack and died, age 53. His unfinished manuscript about the Callahan case was found in his office, incomplete but containing extensive research notes. His family donated the materials to the Maine Historical Society, where they remain today. In 1978, another fragment emerged. A graduate student at the University of Maine, conducting research on turn-of-the-century crime, interviewed an elderly woman named Susan Whitmore, granddaughter of Sheriff Thomas Whitmore. Susan was 92 years old, living in a nursing home in Augusta, her memory fading but still sharp about certain things. She told the graduate student, a young woman named Jennifer Cole, that her grandfather had shared something with her father, Susan's own father, shortly before his death in 1924. Sheriff Whitmore had received a letter, postmarked from Los Angeles, dated 1923. The letter was unsigned, but the handwriting matched samples from Eleanor Callahan's journals. The letter was brief. "Dear Sheriff Whitmore, I read with interest your interview in the Bangor newspaper. You were always more perceptive than I gave you credit for. You're correct in your assessment. I did learn from my mistakes. I learned patience, discretion, and the value of mobility. I also learned that people see what they expect to see. An elegant older woman involved in charity, generous, with her time and money, is above suspicion almost everywhere. You'll never find me, Sheriff, but I wanted you to know that you were right. I am still here, still vital, still pursuing my research. The world is large, and I have decades yet to live. Perhaps we'll meet again in whatever comes after this life." Until then, I remain respectfully yours, E.C. Sheriff Whitmore had shown the letter to his son, made him swear never to reveal it publicly while any of the victims' families still lived. Thomas Whitmore's son kept that promise, but told his daughter Susan shortly before his own death in 1955. Susan, in turn, shared it with Jennifer Cole, feeling that enough time had passed. Cole searched for the original letter but couldn't find it. It wasn't among Sheriff Whitmore's archived papers, wasn't in his family's possession. Either it had been destroyed or was still hidden somewhere. Cole included Susan's account in her master's thesis, but without the physical letter, most historians dismissed it as a family legend. But then came one more fragment, the most disturbing of all. In 1982, a construction crew working on a renovation project in downtown San Francisco discovered human remains under the basement floor of an old Victorian building that was being converted into condominiums. The building had been constructed in 1905, had served various purposes over the decades. The remains were old, at least 50 years, possibly older. Forensic analysis identified bones from multiple individuals, perhaps 6 or 7, all male, all showing similar patterns of dismemberment and processing to those found in Maine. The San Francisco Medical Examiner noted the similarities to several historical cases, including the Callahan case. But the remains were too degraded for DNA analysis. This was 1982, before modern DNA technology, and there was no way to definitively connect them to any specific suspect. The building's ownership records were complicated, passing through multiple hands over the decades. In 1905-1906, it had been owned by a woman named Sarah Blackwell, described in city records as a widow of independent means, involved in charitable work with transient populations. No photographs of Sarah Blackwell existed in public records. She'd sold the building in 1917 and disappeared from San Francisco records. Where she went, if she was the same person as Victoria Morrison or Eleanor Callahan, remains unknown. The San Francisco case received limited media attention. It was one strange discovery among many in a city with a long and sometimes dark history. The remains were eventually given a proper burial in a city cemetery, marked with a simple stone. Unknown men, rest in peace. Jennifer Cole, who had completed her master's thesis 4 years earlier, saw a newspaper article about the San Francisco discovery. She traveled there, reviewed the case files, examined the forensic reports. The similarities to the Maine case were striking. She wrote a follow-up article for a historical journal connecting the dots between Maine, Portland, Baltimore possibly, Chicago possibly, and San Francisco. She titled it "The Century Woman, Tracking a Serial Killer Across America." The article generated renewed interest in the Callahan case. True crime writers began researching it. A documentary film crew from PBS interviewed Cole and produced an hour-long program in 1985. The case entered popular culture, inspiring novels, plays, even a horror film, loosely based on the events. But no definitive proof ever emerged. No grave marker for Eleanor Callahan, no death certificate, no confirmed final sighting. She remains one of American criminal history's most elusive figures. So what happened to Eleanor Callahan? After more than a century, we still don't know for certain. The official record declares her legally dead as of 1908. But that's a legal fiction, a bureaucratic necessity. The truth is far more ambiguous. There are 3 main theories, each with its proponents and evidence. Theory 1, early death. Some historians believe Eleanor died shortly after fleeing Maine, possibly from illness, accident, or even suicide. She was 47 years old in 1901, and despite her beliefs about rejuvenation, she was human. She may have succumbed to pneumonia during a harsh winter, drowned crossing a river, or been killed by someone who discovered her identity. Her body could lie in an unmarked grave somewhere, or was lost to the elements. This theory explains why no confirmed sightings ever materialized, why the trail went cold so completely, but it doesn't explain the Portland disappearances, the possible sightings, the 1923 letter, or the San Francisco remains. Theory 2. New identity, limited activity. This theory suggests Eleanor assumed a new identity and settled somewhere quietly, perhaps even giving up her crimes. The trauma of nearly being caught might have shocked her into changing her behavior. She might have lived out her remaining years as an ordinary person, her dark past hidden, dying naturally in the 1920s or 1930s. This theory is psychologically plausible. Some criminals do stop, but it contradicts what we know about Eleanor's personality. She was methodical, patient, and deeply committed to her delusions. People with her psychological profile rarely stop voluntarily. Theory 3. The Century Woman. This is Jennifer Cole's theory, the most disturbing but perhaps most consistent with the evidence. Eleanor Callahan didn't die in 1901 or shortly after. She continued her crimes under multiple identities across different cities for decades. She learned from her mistakes in Maine, became more careful, more mobile, chose victims even less likely to be missed. She moved every few years, never staying long enough to establish the pattern that ultimately exposed her in Bangor. She might have lived into the 1940s or even 1950s, claiming dozens more victims across America. This theory accounts for the Portland disappearances, the possible sightings, the San Francisco remains, and the psychological profile of someone who truly believed her actions were justified. Which theory is correct? We'll probably never know. But consider this. Between 1900 and 1950, thousands of men disappeared across America without explanation. Most were transients, workers, sailors, men without families or connections. Their disappearances were rarely investigated. They became statistics, if they became anything at all. How many of them might have fallen victim to Eleanor Callahan or others like her? The case raises uncomfortable questions about vulnerability, visibility, and value. Eleanor chose victims from society's margins, people whose absence wouldn't be immediately noticed or mourned. In doing so, she exploited not just individual isolation, but systemic indifference. Her crimes were enabled by a society that didn't much care what happened to transient men. It also raises questions about the nature of evil. Was Eleanor insane, as contemporary observers wanted to believe, or was she something else, rational, intelligent, fully aware of what she was doing but operating under a moral framework so different from normal human empathy that we struggle to comprehend it? Her journals suggest someone who genuinely believed her actions were justified, even scientific. She wasn't a monster of impulse, but of philosophy, however twisted. To this day, no one knows the truth about what ultimately happened to Eleanor Callahan. The mansion is gone, burned to ash. The cave is sealed, the victims are buried. The killer vanished into history like smoke, leaving only fragments, questions, and the cold knowledge that for at least 11 men, and possibly many more, a dinner invitation from an elegant widow was the last thing they ever received. The Callahan case remains open in Maine criminal records. Technically, Eleanor could still be prosecuted if she were somehow found alive, though that's biologically impossible now. But the case stays open as a reminder, a memorial to the victims, and an acknowledgement that some mysteries never receive clean resolution. If you've stayed with me through this dark journey, thank you. I know these stories aren't easy, but I believe it's important to remember them, to honor the victims by not forgetting they existed, that they mattered, that their lives were stolen by someone who saw them as mere resources. Now I want to hear from you. Which theory Do you believe? Do you think Eleanor died shortly after fleeing, or do you believe she continued her crimes for decades? Could there have been more accomplices we never discovered? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and your theories often give me new perspectives on these cases. If you found this investigation compelling, please consider subscribing to our channel and hitting the notification bell. We're building a community here, a gathering of those who dare to look into history's darkest corners. There are more stories to tell, more mysteries to explore, more forgotten victims who deserve to be remembered. Share this video with someone who appreciates true historical mysteries. Leave a like if you found it informative. And join us again soon as we continue our journey into the shadows of the past. Until then, remember, history isn't just what's written in textbooks. Sometimes the most important stories are the ones that were buried, sealed away, or simply forgotten. Our job is to unearth them, examine them, and learn from them. Thank you for being part of our haunted community. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and I'll see you in the next investigation.